Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the EPC. We're absolutely delighted that you decided not only to spend your lunch break with us, but to devote time towards the end of the year to a subject that has been very high on our agenda for many years and continues to do so. And that is the future of relations between the United Kingdom and the European Union that have taken a different shape and context since the United Kingdom left the Union. What we're aiming to do in this series is, in the framework of a number of online policy dialogues, is to look at the future of EU-UK relations in various policy areas. And this one is going to be devoted to defense and security, an area where we have seen over the past months certainly a lot of political ambition. Needless to say, a strong need to strengthen European security in light of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And I'm very happy and delighted that we have two great speakers who are going to engage in this conversation with me today. I warmly welcome Amelia Hadfield, Professor and Head of Politics and International Relations at the University of Surrey, and also the founding director of the Centre for Britain in Europe. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
And I would like to also warmly welcome Charles Grant, Director at the Centre for European Reform. And Charles, as you know, and good to have you back also with the EPC, Charles has been a long-standing, not only observant, commentator and sharp mind and voice on things EU, European, but also someone whom we're happy to count among those who help us think about these things. So Charles, very good to have you also here in our conference setting. The way we are going to do this, and a very warm welcome to all those who are joining online. You are absolutely invited to engage in this conversation. Please make sure that you type your questions and comments into the Q&A chat functions, into the chat function, I should say, not the Q&A function, into the chat function of this technical platform, because this will allow me to make sure that we're using our tight 1 hour very well, and that we can also see that our panelists have the chance to respond to those questions. So please feel warmly invited. Please mention your name so that we can place that. And without further ado, I would like to kick this off and just start in a kind of almost like a warming up exercise, looking back at so the last 6 months or so. I mean, there was, of course, on both sides of the channel, the European Union leadership getting back in place and following up on the European Parliament elections. Now having sailed off a few weeks ago, it took slightly longer than building a new government in the United Kingdom. So Prime Minister Starmer sailed off a little while ago. But what we did discuss earlier this year in an initial kickoff of the series was a visible rapprochement on things European coming from London. And this was certainly met with great interest in Brussels. And I would just sort of want to understand, Charles, as someone who's been following the EU-UK relationship over the different tides and storms that we've had over the past years and decades, indeed, where you see the overall relationship placed, looking at the government of Prime Minister Starmer. How has it evolved over the past months, and how do you assess the potential for collaboration on the one hand with regard to the European Union, strictly speaking, but also with regard to things European? And then I will also put the same question to Amelia to kick us off. Please, Charles.
Thank you, Almut. I'm getting a bit disappointed with Starmer's government. I mean, clearly the intention is good from my point of view. They want a closer relationship with the EU. They want to restore trust and confidence. They want to have what they call a reset. And that's fine. And they're saying the right things. And we have Keir Starmer planning to go to a meeting of European leaders to discuss defence in February. And there'll be a summit between the UK and the EU, the first ever summit in the spring. We don't know the date yet. The process is okay, really. But the problem is the content. I think our European partners are getting rather frustrated. They don't actually know what the British want. I think the main difficulty is that Starmer and his colleagues are still extremely scared of the Reform UK party, the right-wing populist party, which did quite well in the last general election, and is now scoring in the opinion polls roughly the same level as the Conservatives and the Labour Party. They're very scared of this party, and this party is very anti-migration, it's very anti-European. So already some people in the Labour leadership are sort of behaving as if the next general election campaign had already begun, though it's more than 4 years away. And they're reluctant to be seen to talk too much about Europe or do too much about Europe in case Reform UK does very well and they do very badly. And they're quite unpopular already for reasons nothing to do with Europe. So I'm getting a bit frustrated. I think they need to work out what they want. They need to show our European partners that they are willing to do things that are unpopular for the national interest. And so to reassure our partners that they're not going to get blown off course by when the Daily Mail or the Reform UK says boo. And they need to show that they can take the British people with them. That's my third criticism, is I think they need to, Starmer and his ministers need to make speeches saying we need a closer relationship with the EU because it's good for our economy and good for our security, and this is why we're going to do it. And I think they need to be a bit braver. I haven't given up hope. I mean, they're only 6 months into the Labour government. Next year is still to come. I think that with any luck, the summit will set an agenda for future cooperation. It will sign a deal on security, a pact on security, which we'll come to discuss in a minute, I suspect, and may set an agenda for an improved economic relationship as well. So I think next year there's a chance to put things on a more forward-looking basis and get a better cooperation going next year. But so far I'm quite disappointed.
Before I I turn to Amelia. Just a follow-up question, Charles, because I thought it was quite a bold and perhaps a bit of a risky move, but I admired his move, Prime Minister Starmer's move in the first place, to say, we're not going to join anytime in my lifetime the European Union again, but there is space for collaboration with Europe and with the European Union. And that was when he started off, as you were describing. Was that a miscalculation? Was that the wrong move? Is the breathing space still not there, as you're describing?
Well, it wasn't, I think, the wrong move to say we're not going to rejoin anytime soon. I would have said in the next few decade or so rather than in my lifetime. Perhaps he didn't need to go that far, but I think the way the politics of it is this: a majority of the British people actually regret Brexit, even those who voted leave. Many of them now think it was a mistake. That doesn't mean they want to rejoin the EU, I'm afraid. They regret it, but now they think we are where we are. We better make the best of a bad job. And if you ask people, do you want another referendum on rejoining? The answer is no. Even people who are Remainers don't really want to have the awful business of another referendum. So we have to make the best of what we got. The 3 red lines that Starmer has set, the key red lines are no single market, no customs union, no freedom of movement. And I think we have to accept those for this Parliament, and they will remain red lines. But I still think, in my view, there's a lot we can do to get closer economically and in terms of security, without breaching those red lines, and we can have a better relationship while respecting those red lines.
Amelia, just turning to you, how does this look from your vantage point? Do you share Charles's disappointment and skepticism about the sort of the breathing space and the room for maneuver for the government of Keir Starmer? And then, of course, I also want to turn slowly to our question of European security and ask a sort of a temperature question on that as well. But Amelia, your take on where things stand right now.
I share the skepticism of Charles, but I think to make it an interesting debate, I'll plump for a little bit more enthusiasm and try to look for ways in which the visible rapprochement that you mentioned has sown a few seeds. So obviously, since the election, and don't forget, Labour's platform on this was very, very clear to signal the closer relationship with Europe in a variety of areas, ambiguously cast, but I think quite warm in tone, obviously. And within a day or two of the election, Starmer has had a number of very well-timed opportunities to put the meat on those bones. I think perhaps the most important one was the EPC summit in Blenheim Palace in July. But since then, we've seen Labour in different formats doing the rounds. So we've seen David Lammy Foreign Secretary, and Defense Secretary, John Healey, conducting the sort of magical mystery tour, if you like, of European capitals, and agreeing to bilats, which possibly we'll talk about in a minute, including with Germany. And I think important steps forward, like David Lammy being able to not just meet former High Representative Joseph Borrell, but being invited, to sit in on the Foreign Affairs Council. For me, it's an important first step. And then agreeing to bi-monthly foreign policy dialogues and get-togethers as well. So that's I think part and parcel of Keir Starmer's ability to want to move beyond the TCA. But I think there have been some hiccups. I think that has borne out and provided a degree of frustration. Failing to build a narrative, perhaps. It's one thing to have a warm tone, but not to have a clear narrative, I think, is something else as well. So I think I'd probably dub this the sort of brave new reset. And I think what we've seen is a variety of Labour personages trying to build a new sense of momentum, having slightly lost their way, perhaps in September and October. So this is borne out by people like Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, going to Brussels, interestingly, to speak to the Eurogroup of Euro area finance ministers, speaking to Antonio Costa, new European Council president, who came to Downing Street to see Starmer in Brussels, Lammy in the FAC, etc. So there's been a bit of good sort of diplomatic tennis back and forth, if you like. But you're right, Almut, they're sort of circling around this idea of what is actually wanted on either side. What is the nature of the deeper cooperation, specifically on defence, including perhaps on EU defence structures? We can talk about that in a minute. But I think the idea of the reset is still to be clarified, and there is acceptance and pragmatism, I would say, on the EU side. Interesting to see the quote by the German finance minister, Cookies, who said, these red lines have to be respected. Single market, customs union, free movement, these have to be respected, even if they put fairly hard limits on what can be achieved. So somewhere there is a sort of compromising position and an uncompromising position. But the question remains, and Charles is right on this, the UK side urgently needs to ask itself what it's doing at this point, whether it's done enough to begin to sort of challenge a number of Brussels orthodoxies that might need to be broken down, and to really make the case for the UK. At the post-Brexit case, it can't make the rejoining EU case. That's certainly not on the horizon, but making the post-Brexit case in this very febrile geopolitical context, that it should have what I would call a sui generis relationship. So it needs to really put the meat on those bones. They have to just do it rather carefully. They can't kind of be too waspish about it and suggest that it's the UK defining the EU's interests. So that's a very fine line to walk. And I think perhaps oddly, in a weird way, in security and defence, because it's not supranational and because there is a profound need for that rapprochement, perhaps it gives a little more surface area to both sides to try to craft that form of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Is it now moving sort of towards the security angle and what a security partnership could or should look like? Is it less risky from a domestic point of view to talk European security, because this was never in the first place seen as something that was related to the European Union? The European Union considered as weak and not working on those matters. What is the breathing space there, Amelia, and then perhaps also Charles, because the domestic nature of the relationship between the UK and the European Union is, of course, a very relevant one, something which probably Europeans, because it's completely not the case for continental Europeans. And the sort of, probably the opposite, the wish to have the United Kingdom rejoin in different ways would be very welcome. But if you were to sort of look at more the area of European security, where arguably, of course, European continent has a very, very strong interest in having the UK not only but then in a position of leadership, because this is what the UK could bring to the table. How do you look at this through the domestic lens? Is that equally difficult to sell, or is that a more intuitive thing? To what extent does European security for a British electorate still feel like this is about us as much as it's about the continent?
I think it is more intuitive. I think it's less touchy. I think there's a clearer overall sense that European and British security are very tightly aligned in terms of whose interests need to be supported. I think the Brexit made maybe less damage than it has with other areas. Obviously, if you just cast your mind back to the June 2018 agreement that Theresa May came up with, that was the first attempt at a sort of comprehensive security setup, and that was something that I think was agreed and not seen as particularly revolutionary, and it was quite deep. There was talk of structured cooperation across a variety of levels. Now the Johnson government obviously dropped that, and the result is that there is no foreign and security policy, not in the formal structured relationship between the UK and the EU in this area. And yet we have continued to see, and the bittersweet reality, of course, is the invasion of Ukraine, where you continue to see British operations and coordination and leadership that have brought about, ironically, very improved political relations between the UK and the European Union after those difficult years of the Brexit negotiations. And I think from the British perspective, there is a very real understanding from a values-based perspective, from a strategic perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, that it is right and quite natural and very needed for Britain to maintain and work harder, frankly, not just in NATO, but with the European Union as a whole, on security and defense. So I don't think that's likely to be a painful touch point. It's certainly much more likely to be something like freedom of movement, or possibly migration, because it's much more contextualized, I think, within the sense of pressures, policy-specific pressures, where Britain has maybe less of a stake in terms of, less of a say, I should say, in terms of security and defense. So I'm sure Charles will have things to say on this as well, but I would like to see the UK much more of a significant geopolitical actor, working much more emphatically in security and defense, and the time is right at this point.
Well, Charles, let's turn to you with that, knowing that you've also spent some time in the US recently, and sort of see, I mean, the best that continental Europeans can hope for is a continuation of a very strong UK support on things European security in whatever way, shape, or form, given that there is greater unpredictability about commitment of the United States with regard to that matter.
Yes, I mean, I think the Labour government is actually right to focus initially on security, because that is a fairly uncontroversial area. As you and Amelia have said, it's not politically so difficult in the UK to cooperate on security with the Europeans. There is the Ukraine context. There's the fact that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has nothing in it about security cooperation, very little. And also the British need to find a way of sort of rebuilding trust and confidence with their European partners, and working on security is a good way of doing that. So I think it's right that this is the next step. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, wanted to have a broad security partnership covering things like climate and migration and energy. And he's been told not to do that by the EU, because they think that would touch upon Commission competencies, which would make everything very complicated. So the EU is initially going for telling the British to go for a more narrow agreement focused on foreign and defence policy, which I think is the right thing to do. So I hear that when I was in Brussels in November, I was told that the idea is to sign this security partnership at the UK-EU summit in the spring. But I've subsequently heard that the French are saying, unless we can get reassurances on the amount of fish that they can take from the North Sea around the UK, they're not going to be agreeing to any security deal at all. Hopefully the French may think again about that. I think one of the most difficult areas, which is difficult, is actually defence industry. The French have very strong views on this. They think, and the Brussels institutions tend to think, that only EU-based companies should be able to benefit from the European Defence Fund or the European Defence Industry Programme and various EU programmes that are trying to encourage pan-European procurement and so on, which the EU is trying to do a lot in this area at the moment. But the French are beginning to lose some of the arguments. They used to win the argument. They won the argument for kicking the British out of the Galileo satellite system when the British left the EU. They won the argument on the European Defence Fund, which is a lot of money which British companies can't easily get at all. But I think on the EDIP, the European Defence Industry Programme, I think that the French are getting a bit isolated in these arguments because of Ukraine. A lot of other European countries, particularly those that work with the British defence industry, like the Swedes, the Germans, the Italians, the Poles, the Dutch, want to work with the British and the Americans, and don't want to ban non-EU based companies from working with these European programs. I think defence industry may be more easy for the British in the long run, but because it's difficult and because the EU hasn't actually worked out what it wants to do with it itself yet, I think this will not be part of the security partnership that is agreed in the spring. So I hope it will be agreed in the spring. It's just the British will have to wait and see what happens there, I think.
And just going back to one of the things you said, I mean, on the sort of the fish quota, and those are surely the wrong kind of wordings to get Britain back in if you wanted to get Britain back into the conversation on things European. In your conversations, Charles, and I know you've been doing them for many years in Brussels, do you still feel that there is a sense of officials being a bit snubbed with the fact that this is where it ended, and Brexit was Brexit, and it was done, and it was painful, and kept a lot of people engaged for a very long time, and that was perhaps a waste of time? I mean, do you feel there is a sense of let's not make it too easy again, or is that nothing you would kind of find?
Oh, well, I think the Europeans, not surprisingly, are rather divided on this question, Almut, and I think the British should not underestimate how much damage the Conservative governments, particularly Boris Johnson's government, did to Britain's reputation in the EU. The way it behaved, the way it signed treaties and said it would tear them up if it quite soon afterwards. It's stroppy, difficult, adolescent behaviour really went down so badly. Though the Labour government, obviously, it's not fair to blame it for the behaviour of Boris Johnson's government. There's still a kind of an after effect of what Boris Johnson's government did, which is very, very damaging to the UK. So they're starting in a weak place. And I think a lot of people have not forgotten how the British behaved. And so I think that a lot of the Brussels institutions and the French and some other countries too do want to give the British a hard time. They certainly on the economic relationship, they don't want to allow the British to so-called cherry pick to get close to the single market in certain areas and without accepting free movement, which the British aren't prepared to do. However, as you said, the strategic context has changed with the Ukraine war in particular, and the arrival of Donald Trump in America. So I think a lot of European countries, particularly those most concerned with the Ukraine war, to the countries in the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, that's the Nordics and the Baltics in particular, and the Dutch, but also the Poles who are not in the JEF, and to some degree, perhaps the Germans, are saying, look, we need the British for our security, so let's hug them close for security. And if they say they want a better economic deal, then why should we be churlish and say no? But so there are arguments within the European Union on this, and I think von der Leyen herself may be more flexible than some of her officials, though I can't speak for her but I think many people believe she's going to be more flexible than her officials. So I think when the French say no deal on security without giving us assurances on fish, I think other countries would say security is so important, let's just do the deal on security and then haggle about the fish later when they get onto the economic relationship.
Charles, you mentioned the Joint Expeditionary Force. You mentioned EDIB, the procurement angle, the single market related, more touchy issues. We will return to those in a more granular way shortly. But I would just like to turn to Amelia again to sort of the broader strategic context and the US angle, because I mean, I've just finished a little piece on the impact of the new US administration on European foreign policy. There is, of course, a great deal of concern, certainly about unpredictability, but some profound questions in parts of Europe on, whether the US under Donald Trump will be willing to provide that sort of underpinning of European security capacity as it has done in the past, to the extent that it might even decide, to send signals that suggest the opposite, and that would leave Europe hanging quite loosely and quite exposed. So where do you place your thinking around a EU-UK angle with regard to things transatlantic?
Well, I think you're quite right. There's profound disquiet now as a result of Trump's imminent arrival in the White House. I heard a rather nice quote not so long ago that one should take Trump seriously, but not literally. I think this was in reference to tariffs, but I think also this may have a nice way of interpreting transatlantic relationships as well. I think it puts the UK in a really invidious position. I think on the one side, there's this natural need. I hate to use the word the special relationship, but there's this sort of sense that they're the broker of choice. possibly, there's no other alternative at this point, but they are somehow the transatlantic connective tissue in major policy areas, and they best can sort of translate EU sides and requirements to the US and vice versa. I don't really hold with that. I think at this point, I think not only has that kind of format probably passed its sell-by date, it's uniquely inapplicable to the kind of place that we are now. And the other option is, of course, if they can't be the transatlantic interlocutor, the suggestion that somehow the UK has to make a decision and hug the European Union closer, or plump behind Trump, if you like. And Starmer's been quite good, I would say, in this respect, in saying I'm not going to be forced into making a polar choice. I don't actually need to do that. I think in a way it's so obvious that the macroeconomic and trade-based requirements have already put Britain, in the European camp. There's no choice at all. What they're doing is, I think the UK is bracing itself for trade spats, possibly, tit for tat trade-based options. There is going to be no big UK-US trade-based deal. That was a pipe dream last time around, and it's not going to happen this time around. There may be small wins, I think, it depends on what's negotiated. So trade, I think, is off the table. But I think in terms of the UK's ability to insulate the very real Trump-based repercussions against NATO, Britain perhaps is one of the few best shields now to continue internal domestic leadership within NATO, continue to argue in a much more professional way about the need to continue spending, interoperability, coordination, collaboration, because it's much better done domestically from a bottom-up organic perspective than being shouted at and threatened effectively, and having change produced from that way, particularly against the context of the invasion of Ukraine. So I would probably suggest that the Labour government needs to continue to not be seen to have to make a choice between the two, work the diplomatic back channels as well as they can, not be drawn into the opportunity of having a broad transatlantic trade spat with the US. That's certainly not going to happen. But maybe make use of a slight clarification of what their role might mean by providing additional security and defense leadership in Europe, but also working in a much more streamlined fashion with the European Union.
Just to follow up on, I mean, in an ideal world, I believe what would be smart is if we were to sit here on the 19th of December to think, what if we were in this wonderful world in which the European Union and member states have found a good division of labor, something which, interestingly, Commission President von der Leyen is trying to do with Kubilius's work on European defense, getting the buy-in of member states to basically, in my understanding, make sure that the European Commission is helpful to member states' commitment to European security, and using also perhaps money that the EU would mobilize for that. And in this ideal world, also the collaboration with the new leadership in NATO is one that is maturing, where Europeans can trust that here's a leader at the helm of NATO that knows the European Union's big tables also very well. And member states understand that eventually we have to overcome this idea that it's either in or out. And we work, Charles, as you were suggesting, with other Europeans. Third countries sounds rather hostile, but the non-EU Europeans that certainly bring a lot of weight to the table, such as the UK. Another, of course, country we're looking at is Norway. So, if you were to map your ideal world, and I know this is not sort of, not a Christmas time question, really, because it's too serious. But how do you see this old kind of battlefield that we've had, institutionally speaking, that has been sometimes really weighing onto what needed to be done? How do you see that evolving? Because in my observation, in a way, we are seeing a lot of improvement here, and I'm actually more optimistic. Because Ursula von der Leyen, I think, has the right instincts. Rutte clearly has, and perhaps in member states, it's also understood that we need to be a bit more flexible. We can't look in a kind of schematic way. at this. Whatever delivers on European security needs to be done, sort of spirit. Amelia, maybe you go first, and then we'll have Charles.
I think you have to be seen to be useful, and I think that's probably the best sort of overall rationale. I think with new NATO leadership, that's a good open door. That's a good opportunity. Jeff, I think it's a great thing to reference. I think what's interesting is perhaps with the upcoming strategic defence review here in the UK, the opportunity for the UK to strengthen its specific role in European defence architecture via Jeff, and thereby also increase its value to NATO. So it's ticking a number of boxes. So again, just try to find ways in which to be useful. I would really want to fly the flag very briefly for Jeff here. I think it's a really key framework and a slightly unacknowledged one in many ways within the European security architecture. And the challenge, of course, is that its next decade is going to be much more challenging than its first. The backdrop of European security has just fallen away completely since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So it's operating in a much more dangerous and volatile world. But that's the kind of area where I think British security and defence operations are probably going to thrive. And if they have to do that against a fall away of reliable US security commitments to Europe, again, there's a vacuum that perhaps non-European actors like the UK can begin to fill as well. So I think more is going to be demanded of the UK, and possibly Jeff as just one tool to help contribute to European security. So I think we're looking at, where are those inflection points? So we have a new commission. We've got von der Leyen's rather more pragmatic approach. I think you're quite right to mention that, Almut. You've got new NATO leadership, etc. You've got a renewed push in Ukraine, and we've got a host of other sort of bilateral relationships that the UK is rounding on. The only thing I might say is we're busy talking about the content, but we might need to just spare a thought for the form of what that pact is going to look like, and what those relationships are going to look like. And there's been a little bit of work done that. And really it's strong, medium, and soft in a sense. It's as strong as a strategic partnership agreement, if you like, something that's really sort of emphatically a governance mechanism. It could be medium, sort of joint declaration, joint statements, if you like. It could be lighter than that, memorandum of understanding almost. And then the lightest one, and in an odd way, and that's kind of where Charles began, you have just a joint statement. And we've had a lot of meetings and a lot of sort of quasi-summits, with summits yet to come in 2025. So what I'm busy looking at is the way in which you work from the lightest in the form of the format of the mechanism up to the hardest. And I think it's right to do it that way around. You don't start for something incredibly complicated and demanding, and then just watch the whole thing fall apart because it collapses under its own weight. I think you start softly. That's probably ideologically more helpful as well. And then you craft and you build and you garner political enthusiasm and will and commitment, incredibly important in security and defense. And you effectively, from a stepwise fashion, incrementally work your way up. So.
And arguably, Charles, at this point in time, messaging is rather important, even though, of course, it only has a certain shelf life. You need to be able to deliver on it. But, my ideal world that I was trying to sort of map out with Europeans finding institutional cohesion and a commission being more pragmatic, and member states understanding also the role of the commission in defense procurement. Where do you place yourself? Do you share the sort of the more optimistic outlook I have on this?
Possibly. I think we have to work at all levels. I think it's very important to get a closer UK-EU security relationship. In foreign policy, we need to find a mechanism to plug the British in so that they can learn what's going on, influence their former partners a little bit, and build alliances and friendships, which they badly need. So I think that's on defence policy. They need to sign an agreement with the EU so they can take part in EU military missions. The current EU rules don't allow third countries any say in decision making, but clearly if the British are going to send 5,000 troops on an EU military mission, they have to be given some role in how those troops are used. So we need to revisit the rules for defence missions. I think so. The EU level is part of it. The other part of it is the bilateral and the minilateral, which we haven't really talked about so much. The UK-EU Trinity House, sorry, the UK-Germany Trinity House agreement a few months ago is actually quite extensive and quite interesting. It's the precursor of what will be a UK-Germany treaty. It talks about long-range precision strike, working together on drones, air defence, quite a lot of serious stuff in it. And it's explicit about saying that it's one side of what the British regard as a triangle of relationships, the triangle being Britain, France, and Germany, because there's already the Lancaster House Agreement between the UK and France, which will be revisited quite soon, I believe. There's also a lot of, obviously, many agreements between France and Germany on defence. So I think the British see this trilateral format as quite important. And of course, they're also taking part in what's been called the Weimar Plus meetings, which have happened a couple of times in recent weeks, whereby the Weimar countries, Poland, France, and Germany, meet with Italy, Spain, and the UK, plus the High Representative for Foreign Policy, a group of 7 to kind of to bolster support for Ukraine and kind of try and firm up support amongst the smaller European countries for helping Ukraine. I think this Weimar Plus format is quite interesting because the British are part of it, which is very, very highly desirable, I believe. So I think the British need to find ways of working with the EU at the EU level, bilaterally, minilaterally, and of course NATO remains fundamentally important for the British. And I think we're all going to have to worry about defence spending. The message I got in Washington was Trump's people say, we'll stay in NATO so long as you spend 3% of your GDPs on defence, which the British spend just over 2% at the moment, but that'll be very hard for the British to get to 3%, as it will be extremely hard for the French and the Germans and many others as well.
I would like to say, all participants who are on screen, please put your questions and comments into the chat. Feel free to do that right now, because I will weave them into our conversation. And Charles, just to stay with, you know, the money question, which is of course an absolutely vital one. Member states are putting forward that they're struggling with their commitments, even though I think a number of countries have understood that, you know, European security is really something existential, and the attack and war of aggression against Ukraine is really something that should concern every European, every free European. The question is then, you know, where does the money come from? And surely, I mean, there is a domestic sort of discussion in the UK about that. I won't go as far as to say it's either NHS or defense. The German Chancellor, who just lost, as anticipated, his vote of confidence in Parliament, is putting forward a platform that says, well, we are going to do both. We're going to invest in security and defense, and we're going to invest in everything that is good for our citizens' social well-being. What does this look like on the other side of the channel?
Well, Amelia will have her own views, but I think so far there isn't really any debate in the UK. I mean, the think tankers and politicians who specialise in defence are saying we're going to have to spend a lot more on defence, but it's not part of the sort of day-to-day political conversation, which is focused on other issues. So I think just like the British haven't woken up to the fact that the EU is doing a lot on defence in its own right. Very few British people understand the EDIP or the EDIRPA or the ASAP or the European Defence Fund, or the fact there's now a Defence Commissioner, Mr. Kubilius. The British don't know what's going on in the EU in defence in general. And as for the money, unless you work in a defence-orientated think tank, you don't know that the Americans are going to make us spend a lot more money on defence to preserve NATO. And I think the debate hasn't begun yet in the UK, but it will, I think, begin. It'll crank up this quite soon, because when Trump's in office, he'll make it quite clear that we have to spend more, including the British. I think the British will have to start debating it. And I think there will be probably a political consensus in favour of doing so, because it's about Ukraine, and to touch wood, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are strongly committed to helping Ukraine. So I think there will be a political consensus to spend more money, but where it comes from, God only knows. Cutting the NHS, increasing taxes a lot, neither is very politically popular.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Amelia.
I think Charles is right. It's still incredibly contentious for the UK to have to suggest the government that money's going back to Brussels. You'd need a kind of cloaking device, and perhaps the best one is Ukraine. And to say we are supporting Ukraine, we're doing this because we lead in NATO, and we need to make sure that the defence ecosystem, the British defence ecosystem, remains fit for purpose. And the only way to do that is to make sure that it's well funded. I think there's probably a bit of a déjà vu amongst British people that, you know, Trump asked this last time around. So it probably won't be a surprise when he comes out punching and saying, actually, it's 3%, not 2%. This will be sort of typical of the sort of 2.0 of Trump. But I don't know if, in real terms, most people will understand what that means for Britain as a whole. The other sort of domestic covering device is the Strategic Defence Review. So providing recommendations for the UK in order to vastly overhaul hardware, software, collaboration with stakeholders, including industry, and the funding to go with it. So that is an opportunity for the government to lay out just what needs to be spent on how much and by when. So I think if you've got NATO/Ukraine and keeping the US at bay on the one side and the Strategic Defence Review on the other, those are two good surface areas on which to land the prospect of more funding. I think the idea perhaps that it's good for British industry, that's something that might fall within Rachel Reeves' overall sort of growth philosophy. It's not been particularly well articulated yet. Beyond that, I mean, is the question of the potential decline in America's commitment to European security, requiring a closer defence relationship between the UK and Europe, and the role of the nuclear component that might play. Again, not much written on this at this point, but the requirements for what the British nuclear arsenal is going to look like and whether that's fit for purpose and how much money is going to be required to keep that up to snuff. And the role that plays within European collective security, I think, is a conversation and quite a costly one in every sense, yet to be had.
I just wanted to return, and then I have a question by Elisa Fancy, who was talking about energy cooperation. But in terms of, Charles, you were talking about the need also for alignment, the opportunity to understand what's happening in the Foreign Affairs Council, and how Europeans assess what's happening in the world. Arguably, we are already seeing very fast that Donald Trump, soon to be arriving in the White House, is creating impact on the ground and shaping a foreign policy environment, because suddenly things are popping up as a reaction to that will probably continue when he comes and actively engages with the world. So that will require a very fast pace. If I was to imagine a world in which this is happening and many security and defense related matters will be on the table, what's the sort of the best mode? The Union itself, the European Union, is not a very fast moving entity, as we know. But surely we have to, or is my understanding, we have to prepare for completely different kind and type of pace, because our reactions need to be fast and they need to be rather decisive. And what does that mean then also for collaboration, cooperation with the UK?
Well, I think you're right. The EU is a very slow-moving actor, but the Starmer government's also turning out to be a rather slow-moving actor as well. I mean, Keir Starmer has many virtues, but taking decisions quickly and decisively and setting out a vision for where he wants to go isn't as yet one of his strong points, to put it mildly. I think that's why these minilateral summits I referred to are quite important. They've been happening at foreign minister level so far, but they could happen at prime minister level. And I think if you meet at head of government level or very senior level, then you can cut through the bureaucracy and just take decisions. That's why I'm very glad Starmer's going to meet his fellow EU leaders in February to discuss defence. But of course, it doesn't help that Europe itself is rather lacking leaders at the moment. Macron is very weak politically and will probably stay quite weak for the remaining 2.5 years of his presidency. Germany may have you know better than me, Almut. Germany may have a new government in, say, May, perhaps. It may become a stronger actor then, but it's been a very weak actor in Europe for the last few years, much weaker than usual. The Commission, von der Leyen, is trying to be a strong actor and has many virtues and is has become a very powerful operator, but she's only running the Commission, which is not a member state government with troops that can be deployed. So I think there's a bit of a leadership vacuum in Europe, which makes it hard for Europe to act decisively.
Donald Tusk in Warsaw, since you, I think, importantly mentioned also the Weimar Triangle, and there's a lot of speculation/hope with regard to the incoming Polish EU presidency as well, having both a strong individual member state outlook on European security, certainly, and the wish to really go ahead in this area, but on the other hand also having the formal role as EU presidency in the council formations. What's your sort of understanding of what Poland can bring to the table?
So who are you asking the question to?
Charles, it was a follow-up question to you.
Okay, fine. Well, I think Poland does have a fairly strong government, and it can hold its head high vis-a-vis Donald Trump, because it's spending, was it 4.5% on defense of GDP? It's spending a lot of its GDP on defense already, and it certainly has very strong views on Ukraine and Russia. My slight worry is that Donald Tusk is still two Donalds. It makes it confusing. Donald Tusk is still partially weakened by the fact that he doesn't control the Polish presidency. Mr. Duda is around certainly for much for a part of next year. Mr. Duda is trying to undermine Mr. Tusk a lot at the times, and I think that kind of distracts Mr. Tusk. And in Brussels, the feeling is that Poland has not turned out to be quite the happy, clappy, wonderful pro-European country that everyone hoped it would become when Law and Justice lost the elections and Tusk formed the governments. But I think one thing that Law and Justice and Mr. Tusk's group in Poland do agree on is being tough on Russia and firmly behind Ukraine, which is so when Tusk and Duda went to Washington, they spoke together, which was actually reassuring and rather heartwarming, in fact. So I think, you know, if Europe needs interlocutors to explain to Trump what we're doing and how we can spend more on defense and how we can help the US, while the EU should remain committed to European security, I think Tusk is part of the answer. Maybe Meloni is also part of the answer, because she, being somebody from the fairly far right background, has good connections to Trump and to Elon Musk. So I think perhaps between them, the unlikely combination of Italy and Spain Italy and Poland may prove rather useful in dealing with Trump.
Yeah, I think this is a very important conversation, I think, to have as well. You know, what the current environment, what kind of union we're going to see. And my sense is more that someone like Donald Tusk has become a lot more mainstream. You know, and the sort of the Europeanness that you're describing is no longer, at least what in my observation, what is making the wind and the tone and the tune in Brussels these days. There's a sense of real a degree of pragmatism that I haven't seen in that way, which will perhaps also be conducive to engaging with the United Kingdom, because it is considered then to be perhaps less ideological. But that is just my take. I want to give Elisa Fancy the floor, who asks, how important do you think it is for the EU and the UK to strengthen energy cooperation in the context of broader security considerations? Amelia, would you like to take this one? Go ahead.
I would indeed. I love all things energy. So yes, please. Yeah, and it's, Lisa, thank you for your questions. Absolutely vital. Energy cooperation is very much in the interests of both sides. Unfortunately, things have not gone particularly well in this area. We've seen lots of foot dragging, and very recently a report from the European Commission advising EU member states not to allow the UK more access, or deeper access, if you like, to the bloc's electricity markets, despite the fact that this will be not a very smart economical move. Industry warnings, indeed, of higher energy bills for all consumers, and a slower transition ultimately to net zero. So the Commission's report is really just says that you can't cherry pick. The single energy market at any rate limits the possibilities for other options. It's not a good idea to divide it. Sectoral participation is the word they use in the EU energy market, is not in the Union's interests. It's contrary to the European Council guidelines, blah, blah, blah. So I personally feel that's very short-sighted. And it's a very defensive sort of response from the bloc as well. And quite frankly, actually, it's at odds with what has been historically very good relations in terms of EU-UK energy interests, which have been very much premised on the idea of deep and continuing cooperation on energy trading from the fossil fuels industry, but now also very much the renewables industry as well. I think that feeling has also been echoed by energy companies in the European Union and the UK as well. They are both keen to see various arrangements take place. I think the most exciting one is the idea of the North Sea becoming a sort of green energy hub. But that cannot take place under the existing arrangements. They're just not fit for purpose, and they need reform. So you're talking about completely overhauling interconnectors, massive development of renewables, including offshore and onshore as well, in order to be able to get to that peak of roughly 310 gigawatts. That's the generational peak from offshore wind by roughly 2050 as well. Now, it's not helped by the incredibly complex pricing mechanisms that you get in the energy ecosphere. And here's one for you to take home for your Christmas dinner: multi-region loose volume coupling, MRLVC. So this was included actually in the EU-UK Trading Cooperation Agreement, but it's never come into force because it's bafflingly complex and largely because of technical problems. And it has hindered good cooperation in the EU electricity market. And that's a problem. Since Ukraine, the UK has actually become a massive gas and also electricity exporter to the bloc. So it's become a really big regional energy hub. And the EU actually hasn't made particularly, great use of what the UK now is in terms of its energy identity. So long story short, energy cooperation is absolutely in the interests of both parties. They're going to have to look at all of the current cross-channel hardware as well, but also look strategically at things like the North Sea, and look at ways in which things like the EU transmission system operates and what to build and what to rebuild. But it's absolutely useless to do that on its own from the European Union. And the UK, frankly, wouldn't want to do it on its own either. So I think there is scope for better cooperation.
Charles, thanks, Amelia. Do you want to come in?
Yes, just very briefly, I totally agree with everything Amelia said. I think I'm very disappointed the Commission taking what in my view is a very short-sighted view on this. I think if the key thing is, for me, the deal on, it's relevant to energy, on veterinary standards. If there's a deal on veterinary standards, that means the British will accept Court of Justice rulings and dynamic alignment with EU rules, because it's in both sides' interest for them to do that, and both sides have agreed with that. But if you do it on SPS, so-called veterinary standards, then you can do it on energy, which is the next area to go for. Both sides have a mutual interest. The British will have to accept Court of Justice rulings and dynamic alignment with the EU rules, but we have so much cheap wind power that the EU wants. We have to anyway align our emissions trading schemes and our carbon border adjustment mechanisms. If we don't, the British will be in some difficulty. And it's in the EU's interest to have the British plugged into their energy systems, because it's cheaper energy for everybody, the British, but also the Europeans. So I think if we can give a lead on SPS, then we can move on to energy. And I think I hope the Commission rethinks some of its hard line on this.
Thanks a lot to you both. Elisa put this question, and then we have a question from the floor being concerned. I'm just summing up that, when there is a change of government in the UK and the similar energy of a previous Boris Johnson government would come back into power, would that, in my words, not be a major trust breaker on future collaboration? That I consider more a comment than a question, but of course it plays a strong role. But I know that my colleague Maria Martisiute also wants to come in with a question. Maria, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. I just have a question. Looking forward, G7 is another important platform for UK's contribution to European and global security architecture. And as Canada assumes G7 presidency from January, do you think European and global security affairs could feature on the agenda alongside economic security? What's your assessment?
Thank you very much, Maria. And Maria is also the one who, in full transparency, was helping to bring this event into flying. So that is why she's on the platform and asking the question directly, because she don't have another technical possibility to do that. But please do keep your questions and comments coming if you would like to do so, because we have to close in about 6 minutes, so last opportunity to do so. On the G7, let us start with Charles and then turn it to Amelia.
It's a very good question. I don't have a lot to say, but I think the G7 is an important forum because Japan's involved and the US is involved. And it's very important we've now seen that the two theaters of Europe and East Asia are really linked by the presence of North Korean troops in Russia and fighting against Ukraine at the moment. So we shouldn't really just think of them as separate theaters with separate issues in them. The Ukraine problem has massive spillovers to the Asian situation and vice versa. If Ukraine is if Russia is able to gobble up Ukraine, then that makes China think it can probably gobble up Taiwan more easily than otherwise would. So I think the G7 is very important indeed, and we should work at all levels. It's also important because it gives a chance for us to get at Trump and explain to Trump some of these issues. Because when I was in Washington and I put this point to some of Trump's people that these theaters are linked, they didn't agree. They said, look, if if Russia takes Ukraine, it doesn't make China more likely to attack Taiwan. That is what a Trump person told me. I think they're wrong, but if the G7 is an opportunity to try and get the message across to Donald Trump that everything is linked up these days.
Thank you, Charles. Amelia.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the opportunity that the G7 presents as a non-EU forum that is still able to support European and global events. So in the arsenal, the diplomatic arsenal, it gives the EU and indeed the UK a card to play. So they get a unilateral opportunity, they get a bilateral opportunity, they get mini lats, and they get multi-lats. G7 sort of somewhere between a kind of a mini and a multi in a sense. 7's a fairly hefty number. And as Charles has said, obviously you've got the US and Japan involved. I find that an astonishing comment, maybe not that astonishing from Washington. The US is facing 4 converging adversaries at this point: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, in 3 theaters. And we don't think we've seen this for some time: Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific, and the Middle East. And the US only has the capacity to prosecute one war at a time, one major war at any rate. So certainly something that came out of the NATO Washington summit, and I'm sure will be echoed in the G7 in July 2024, was the labeling of what these theaters of the prosecution looked like. So, China labeled a decisive enabler of Russia's war on the Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, actively supplying weapons and ammunition to Russia, North Korea, actually sending what we think is an estimated 10,000 troops to counterattack Ukrainian forces in Kursk. So I would have thought US priorities, really ought to be shifting to look at overstretch and overspread, rise of China on one side, its impact on Indo-Pacific security on the other, and indeed what and how far NATO can actually be employed and deployed, if you like. Maybe all the more reason for the European Union and the UK to look at Jeff, for example. But I think for the G7, it's an opportunity to remain relevant, not to be too EU focused, if you like, with just sort of, Canada, the US and Japan, but to really, really think about its why it's important and materially useful as a global forum. So I think the more it discusses challenging theater-based and strategic issues, the more relevant it will remain for the people who are attending.
Well, thank you very much. We have 3 minutes left, and I want to put a question to you both. And that is, the European Council is convening under its President Costa for the last time this year, and UK-EU relations will also feature part of the agenda, which shows the relevance of this as we speak. If we were and had the chance to sit in the second row and whisper into one of the leaders' ear, what would make a difference and what is relevant if we were to get the UK-EU relationship and defense and security right in the next year, which leader would you choose to whisper into an ear, and what is it that you would want to convey? Amelia, you are looking at me still big on the screen, so I will start with you. I throw it at you, which gives Charles a little bit of an opportunity to think more about it.
That's mean.
Please go ahead, Amelia.
Okay, well, I think it's interesting. Costa's got a very different sort of approach. First of all, he's keeping it to one day, so he's instantly popular. I think I would whisper to him to whisper to von der Leyen that they need to bring to bear the full diplomatic arsenal of the Council and the Commission together to really encourage a much more structured mechanism. First of all, I don't think much can happen in foreign policy without that structured mechanism. And even though we've seen great collaborative, positive security and defense developments, they're still a little peripatetic. So I'd want to whisper on the basis of an enhanced structure and more formalized foreign policy mechanisms between the two sides, but a very real reaching out, rapprochement, if you like, from Brussels to London.
Thank you very much, Amelia. Charles.
Okay, well, I would whisper to von der Leyen and to Macron that we need a bespoke, or as Amelia put it, sui generis relationship with the UK. The Commission has an obsession with precedent. I've heard people say we can't give the British a role in decision-making in defence missions, because if we give the British a role, then we have to give the Turks a role. But the British are not the Turks. They're different. They're very close partners in all sorts of ways to their former members of the EU, to their former partners in the EU. that they can contribute hugely to European security. We need a bespoke relationship, which means the French and the Commission have to, and the External Action Service have to soften their hostility to the involvement of British companies in the European defence industrial cooperation, build a unique structured partnership to get the British as close as they can on security without being members of the EU. They can be very close partners on security, and the EU needs to learn to be flexible to accommodate the British and give them a unique relationship they won't offer to the Canadians or the Norwegians or the Liechtensteinians.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This marks the end of our policy dialogue on the future of EU-UK relations. And a huge thanks to Charles Grant and Amelia Hadfield for joining, for sharing their insights, experience, assessments, and for all of you who joined in this late stage of the year. Join me in thanking our speakers. Also join me in thanking my colleagues at the EPC, both Maria and Tatiana, making this happen with research support and also logistical support. And I do hope that all of you who participated in listening mode and putting questions benefited from this. We will be back with the series in 2025. And for now, I wish you all a restful festive season, wherever this finds you. And I look forward to re-engaging. Thanks again, Charles, Amelia, and all best. Goodbye for this year from the Europe in the World program at the European Policy Centre in Brussels.
Thank you very much.